All right, so the final season of Stranger Things is dropping in actually a few hours. And I wanted to use that as a bit of a hook to talk about this episode. So if you haven't seen Stranger Things, the first four seasons, then perhaps find a different one of my episodes to listen to. But if you have, I'm guessing everyone who's still left has, then I wanted to talk about the historical fiction element of Stranger Things. For example, the CIA's mind control experiments that started the whole thing off in Hawkins, MK Ultra. So in the show, you've got subjects that are cast aside completely as collateral, and other subjects are the humans that are weaponized in the pursuit of power. Now, my argument is that the real mind control didn't actually stop. It didn't stop with the CIA, certainly didn't stop in Hawkins. It just changed its medium. It moved from the labs, where it was a bit more invasive, to something a lot more elusive and a lot more subtle. It changed the screens in our pockets, weaponizing our attention and our perception. So, this is where I'd like to introduce something called the availability heuristic, which is the whole idea that we judge the likelihood of an event based on how easily examples of that event come to mind. The issue is it's a lot easier to call on negative examples when that's all we see in the news. And this is the problem with negative media. Excessive consumption of sensationalized negative media, for example, crime and disaster reports, it warps our perception of risk entirely, making us overestimate danger. So I get this all the time when I go onto a plane, for example. I'm not the best flyer. I'm very good at landing, but not necessarily the best flyer. It's very easy when you're sat in that seat to recall films, fiction, entire fiction, of when the plane journey hasn't gone to plan. But then in doing so, you kind of cast away all the times that you have been on a plane, or all the times that you have seen planes, and it's absolutely fine. This is just an example with me. I'm sure that there's other ways that this availability heuristic plays out in everyone's lives. But this is just the way that it definitely plays out for me. But then you kind of reassess and it's fine. Media is a massive problem here because media is designed to only report on the negative things. If we got a report on every plane journey that was successful and safe and everything like that, we'd probably get bored because the large majority of them are safe. It's the safest way to travel. But when we get reports of like negative reports of planes, that's what sticks in our brain when it comes time for us to travel by plane. Using the example of me and my personal anxiety around flight. Now, one of the ways to get around this, one of the ways that we can design our lives to get around this, is to have something called the media diet, which is cultivating a rational, more accurate perspective of risk and probability intentionally. Ironically, one of the best ways that we can do that is through social media. So, on social media, especially with Instagram, you can long press content and just click not interested. And if we take 5-10 minutes, maybe every week, to do this practice and be more intentional about what we do respond to positively with likes and shares and comments and all the rest of it, then maybe we can curate a feed where we see the kind of creators and the content and the information that we want to see that will push us forward in the direction that we want to go in, whether it's more content about design for our careers, for example, or more content that's funny to lighten our days or whatever it might be. But the important thing here is intentional scrolling, and the intention can be to cut away the dead content and to reinforce the good content rather than mindlessly scrolling and let the algorithm dictate what it is that we see. Well, no, not let the algorithm dictate what it is that we see, because that happens anyway. We're always training the algorithm, whether we're doing it intentionally or not. But we need to make sure that we do it intentionally, is what I mean. The issue is, even if we control our input, the media machine in general still designs the rules of the game for the entire society. It's not just about what we watch, but what the media, in inverted commas, want us to believe about the system itself. So if we're getting all of our information from this media machine, then how can we trust that the media machine has our intentions at heart? Who is it that's pulling the strings of the media machine? This is classic mass media narrative. And for this, there's only one person ready to go to, and it's the philosopher of manufactured consent, Mr. Noam Chomsky himself. So, Noam Chomsky, American linguist, philosopher, and political activist who was a leading voice in critical media theory and intellectual dissent. Now, I'm going to read a quotation directly from him and this manufacturing consent, which I think will help propel this whole conversation forward. So, the mass media serve as a system for communicating messages and symbols to the general populace. We know that. It's their function to amuse, entertain, and inform, and to inculcate individuals with the values, beliefs, and codes of behavior that will integrate them into the institutional structures of the larger society. So, the job of the media is to make us good citizens, essentially. But what does good look like? There's been a lot of discourse online about how school is trying to make us into good workers, but not necessarily the workers who get to the highest levels, for example. I can't remember the last time that I had to do like a set of exams or remember things off the top of my head for my job. Now, I'm a designer, it's not the same for everyone, but it is something to say that the rules that we learn in school are very rigid, and that doesn't apply to all aspects of life, certainly not all jobs and careers. So, school is just one example that school's training kids to become good workers in the same way that media is training us to become good members of society. But is society being good to us in return? And is it being fair to us? Or are we being seen, are we kind of victims to the society? So there's also a bit of irony. Chomsky also argues that media is used for diversion through entertainment. So it's used as a distraction. And it's ironic because I started this conversation talking about Stranger Things. But Stranger Things, I suppose, if it opens up this kind of philosophical outlook, then it's a net positive. So to combat this, we must consciously discard unnecessary input. This is really, really important. This is part of the design diet. So Naval's spoken about this. He said that almost all biases are time-saving heuristics. For important decisions, discard memory and identity and focus on the problem itself. This is classic, it's kind of stoic. Get rid of your emotions and focus on the problem itself. This is really, really important to do. Sahil Bloom has also said to not consume the news unless we're highly confident that it will matter a month from now. So the reason that these quotations are important is because when we look at Naval, all biases are time-saving heuristics. The media makes us lazy, right? The biases that we get from the media makes us more lazy because it stops us from actually thinking about the problem. We see this a lot with problems of immigration in the UK, at least. Now, I have not got the solution in my head. However, I think it would be reasonable to say that a lot of people in the UK have their opinions on immigration, whether for or against, because of a lot of the media that they've consumed, potentially pretty passively, right? Me, myself, and I are included. If we consume media passively, that information still gets into our brains and it does dictate our opinions on things. And this is a time-saving bias. We don't want to do the work required to have an opinion. We don't want to do the work required to actually think, what do I actually think about this? What would be a solution? So we just want to get the information ourselves. And we've been doing this since we were at school. We've been reading Spark Notes about Shakespeare because we didn't want to have our own opinion about Shakespeare. We just wanted to get the right answer at school. So you can see how school, potentially, this is a thought that I'm kind of doing off the dome here, school may have also potentially taught us to not be critical thinkers. I thought that anyway, but that's just another example as to how that happened. It's important to focus on the problem itself, and we're not taught that in school, as I've just illustrated, but also at large, I don't think we really do that. But it's also because we're so busy with work, we don't have the time. Who has the time to really delve and look into it? So we tell ourselves that we trust the experts, even though the experts, are they really? Are they really? And then Sahil Bloom saying, don't consume the news unless you're highly confident it will matter a month from now. I'd also add to that and say the news source itself needs to be reputable and or objective in that specific thing that it's reporting about. Objective news is really hard to come by nowadays because everyone's got an agenda, but there's no point in delving really deep in the weeds about something if it's not going to matter a month from now. And this is a good heuristic for a bunch of different things. The whole like, don't buy something unless you're going to want it a month from now, i.e., just wait a month before you buy something, which is really difficult to do with drop culture nowadays, but I digress. So the media system at large, it helps set like a stage for like a pseudo democracy because it makes us believe that our political responsibility is limited to one single act and that's okay. So Kwame Ture, I think that's how you say that, Kwame Ture, middle name, Trinidadian American activist, prominent figure in the civil rights movement, served as the chairman of SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Said, you vote once in 4 years. Depending on the country, it can be different, but you vote once every few years. And that's your political responsibility. That's the height of bourgeois propaganda, making the people politically irresponsible, thinking their responsibility is limited to a one-day vote. Politics is every day. I think this is true. We've been fooled into thinking that democracy is having a say once every few years and that that's the end of it. And in the interim, we're completely at the whims of whatever government it might be, but also whatever media we consume. If the act of voting is designed to make us feel politically responsible, but it minimizes our actual involvement in the political process, what are our elections actually designed to do, to really do? What is it that they actually get for us? And this is where what enters the conversation is George Monbiot. So George Monbiot wrote a really great article in The Guardian a few years ago, and it was shocking. He said that elections are not democracy. In fact, they might be a sign of anti-democracy, or they might be anti-democratic. So he's a prominent British journalist, environmental and political activist, known for his critique of corporate power and traditional political systems. And one of the quotations from him is, an election is a device for maximizing conflict and minimizing democracy. Another quotation is, elections are not democracy and democracy is not elections. So to explain this, Monbiot cites the political design after the American and French revolutions, right? But before we go into that, democracy is often attributed to democratic Athens, right? But actually, as Monbiot observes, Aristotle and Montesquieu observed that elections generated oligarchical and aristocratic rule. After the American and French revolutions, the designers of the new political systems chose elections as a way of excluding the majority, whom they did not trust, from a meaningful involvement in power. This checks out. In 18th century Britain, democracy was a dirty word. Parliament was fearful of the unpropertied majority. This is where the electoral model was settled, designed to keep power in the hands of the elite. So the elections are actually designed to keep the majority out of the democratic process, out of politics. Now, I'll get to a solution in a second, but Will and Ariel Duran, I've mentioned them before. They wrote a book called The Lessons of History, American philosophers, historians. They would argue that this idea of democracy keeping power in the hands of the elite is a natural thing. So in The Lessons of History, they say most governments have been oligarchies ruled by a minority. That's how they define oligarchy. So the minority is either chosen by birth, as in an aristocracy, or by a religious organization, as in theocracies, or by wealth, as in democracies. So in The Lessons of History, Will and Ariel Duran are saying that all democracies have been an oligarchy dictated by wealth. In short, the more wealth you have, the more power you have in a democracy, which kind of goes against this whole romantic idea that we have of democracy, the Athenian ideal of democracy. Another quotation from the Durants: if the majority of abilities is contained in a minority of men, minority of government is as inevitable as the concentration of wealth. The majority can do no more than periodically throw out one minority and set up another, which is what they have observed through the lessons of history. The majority of abilities is contained in a minority of men, and this majority of abilities is just getting narrower and narrower. Although there's also an argument to say that it's getting wider and wider with technology. Now, one person has got the ability to do a wide range of jobs with technology, especially with AI. So now it might be more about discernment rather than ability. So my critical thought of this quotation is that this quotation might be a little bit outdated. It's not if the majority of abilities is contained in a minority of men, it's actually if the majority of resources is contained in a minority of men, or access to technology, or also taste, the ability to discern between what's good and what's bad, because we've all got access to very similar resources. People are losing jobs. Everyone's going to need to be a manager or a CEO in the future. So discernment's going to be even more important. Now, the alternative design for democracy is this thing called sortition, which is another thing that I learned from Monbiot. So this is selecting leaders by lot, similar to jury duty. So in jury duty, at least in the UK, you get a letter in the post. If you're on the electoral register, so every citizen really, can be put up for jury duty, and you just get a letter in the post. It's completely random, and you have to rock up to jury duty. I'm pretty sure your salary gets paid by the government or something, and you just rock up and you do it. This promotes participatory democracy, a system where citizens are directly involved in decision making, not just voting for representatives. Now, I'm sure that there are elements of this which would not work, but as a thought experiment, I think it's interesting because nowadays with algorithms, you have a very unique and foolproof way, and a way that doesn't include humans really, to really truly randomize the process of selection of who's going to get these jobs in office in government. And in doing so, you can select your people for governmental jury duty completely randomly. So you have the highest probability of getting a true cross section of the country. Let's say that there are 12 jobs up for this like cabinet, then you get a true cross section of the country, which means that you get lower, middle, upper class, aristocrats, north, south, east, west. You get them from everywhere. So issues that only affect one small percentage of people, you can't deal with those. You can't do those. If everyone needs to agree on what to move forward with, then you'll get the change that affects the biggest cross section of the country, i.e., you get the change that affects the most number of people. It's still representative democracy or representative government, but the government will be more representative of the people in this way, rather than having people who went to Eton and then Oxford who actually don't really know what they're talking about. I still find it baffling how someone can be the minister for education one year and then the minister for health the next year. Surely those should be whoever has the best qualifications for each of those things. But I'm sure there are people smarter than me who make those decisions. Monbiot suggests that the critique of this system of sortition is often classed as snobbery, a belief that the majority just can't be trusted. Whether or not that's true is up for debate. I think that the argument holds some water. I'd love to hear someone who just completely disagrees with this idea of sortition, because I'm yet to actually hear one. I've spoken to plenty of people from all different walks of life about this. It's very difficult to find a viable argument against this way of government. So, if the system were designed in this way, to just finish off this thought experiment, what does it mean for our personal responsibility to contribute to society? And how does the media destroy our ability to even figure that out? So, if the media is hyper negative or hyper palatable, and the political system is designed for exclusion, as it is at the minute, how can we fulfill our potential and contribute to society? How can we live within this system? We can assume that sortition isn't going to happen in our lifetime. So, how is it that we can fulfill our potential and contribute to society? So, we've we've spoken previously, but also tons of podcasts talk about this. This idea about equality of opportunity versus quality of outcome. So, the brainwashing of media negatively affects our ability to know how we can contribute to society, how we can best contribute, what our best contribution would be. So, John Stuart Mill has a philosophy of quality. And this is a quote from an article that I read about the philosophy. So, this is a secondary source, not directly from the horse's mouth, but for what it's worth. Quotation is, "It is not that all processes are supposed to be equally good or all persons to be equally qualified for everything, but that freedom of individual choice is now known to be the only thing which procures the adoption of the best processes and throws each operation into the hands of those who are best qualified for it." In other words, we have a meritocracy. But in order to have a true meritocracy, we need an equality of opportunity where everyone can best determine their contribution rather than equality of outcome. Now, this is a key distinction because equality of opportunity often means everyone has access to the same education. But what John Stuart Mill is suggesting is that everyone has access to the best education for their own pursuit that they themselves want to pursue. So it's more a case of you have access to, if there's like not an arbitrary, if there's an objective level of education. I'm not talking about GCSEs and A levels and stuff, but like an objective level of education. Everyone has access to that level of education for everything, whether it's being a designer or being a mathematician or a banker or whatever it is. Everyone can get access to that education, but that actually comes secondary. Now that I think about it, everyone should also have access to the ability to determine what their best contribution is. And it's very difficult to do that when there are various things on the line, when you have to put food on the table, for example, because then you're incentivized to get whatever pays the most money or whatever pays some money. Geography can also be a limiting factor. So you need to like try and have all these equalities of opportunity to decide what it is that you actually want to do. Even in a democratic shift, the majority has a structural problem. So another quotation from Will and Ariel Durant, "It is unnatural, as Rousseau saw, for a majority to rule, for a majority can seldom be organized for united in specific action, and a minority can." Now, I've seen this before. Even if we became more democratic, even if we had this equality of opportunity, even if we had all of these different things, majority rule was very difficult because organizing the majority is really, really difficult. And during Black Square Summer, I saw this for sure. There were a lot of people who were quite rightly very angry, especially in the UK. There were a lot of people who were angry. People took to the streets and not in an aggressive way, but people took to the streets through anger, but also wanting to be there for one another. There was also a lot of like camaraderie and solidarity. But everyone was marching for a different reason. Everyone had their own personal reasons for being there. And there didn't really seem to be one united front to try and affect change. And if there's not a united front to affect change, then you don't have a set of objectives as to why you're doing that change. If you don't have a set of objectives, you don't have a set of goals. And if you don't have a set of goals, you don't feel successful. It's as simple as that. You can't, there's a phrase about you can't get better at what you don't measure or something like that. And it's true. If everyone in the thousands of people, it's beautiful, and thousands of people who rocked up for the same cause, everyone was singing from the same hymn sheet, then we'd be able to say definitively whether it was a success or a failure. But I don't think we can, because all we have is arbitrary, things have gotten a bit better in this way, things have gotten a bit worse in this way. Hey, look at the England football team and all this sort of stuff. And it's just, the actual point gets lost in conversations and anecdotes. It's very difficult to unite a bunch of people around one idea. And this is also part of the reason why I love football and sport in general, because sport unites people like nothing else does. So who knows? Who knows? If there is any kind of way to unite everyone around a common idea to push for change and have some kind of majority rule in that way, then fair enough. And the one way that I have seen it in my lifetime that I can think about is actually to do with football uh, during the Super League protests. Whether you were in Stoke or down in London at Tottenham or whatever, you were united, you know? In fact, I think people from rival teams, Arsenal, Tottenham fans, united against Super League. Like, it can happen, but like with all things, you just kind of need a common enemy, I suppose. The important point is that one thing that we can't do is wait for the system to change. We can't wait for a utopia, and we can't be passive in things changing for us. We must design our own personal agency. This is our designer's choice. We must be intentional. We must live by design. Another quotation from Durant, just to kind of close, or to set up the close. So the Durant said, in free enterprise, the spur of competition, the zeal and zest of ownership arouse the productiveness and inventiveness of men. And a basic democracy rules the process insofar as most of the articles to be produced and the services to be rendered are determined by the public demand rather than by governmental decree. So this gives a lot of appeal to the promise of capitalism. And I kind of like it. I don't know where I sit with it, but I don't really mind it. It's saying that, like, the government can't dictate what it is that earns a lot of money. The people do. And this is why we can complain as much as we want about creators earning a lot of money or certain creators earning a lot of money. But the fact is, they don't make the rules, they just play by them. And the rules, as far as I can see, are a lot to do with public demand, especially with social media. You know, if you don't get views, you don't get clicks, you don't get money. Now, the algorithm does push that to an extent, but the algorithm generally pushes the content that people watch for the longest because it's all about selling ad space. So if you can understand the incentives that the social media platforms have, i.e., they want to keep as many people on the platform as possible for as long as possible, then they're going to only pay, or they're going to pay more money for the content that keeps people on their platform. i.e., if you keep people on the platform, you'll get paid more money. So the long and short of it is, if people like your stuff, you get paid. It's pretty simple. That's just one very crude description of this promise of capitalism, as per the Durants. And then they also give a utopia reality check. Utopias of equality are biologically doomed, and the best that the amiable philosopher can hope for is an approximate equality of legal justice and educational opportunity. This again, freedom of opportunity is not freedom of outcome. The utopia of equality, everyone having the absolute same standard, is biologically doomed. And I do agree with this, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't all have the same access to resources and access to education and then legal justice as a result. I think that's also a fair thing. We should all have access to a fair trial and legal justice and all the rest of it. I think that's important, regardless of where you come from or who you are. So, to close, this has been a bit sporadic, it's been a bit everywhere. We cannot change the design of history or the design of the media. We cannot change the fact that the CIA had mind control experiments that went awry at Hawkins and created an army of kids with powers and stuff. But we can architect the inputs and outputs of our life. We can start by taking control of the availability heuristic, and we can design the attention, or what we pay attention to. We can design our environment. We can design what we consume on social media. We can't control the mass media, but we can control social media, as an example. We can design the inputs and the outputs of our life. And that is my speech. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. If you liked this podcast, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like, and shared it with someone who you think would get something from it. Thank you very much for listening to it, and I will see you on the next one.